So whenever you have a passage of scripture that you're going to preach from, it's always tough to look at the verses and try and figure out how exactly to start the sermon, and sometimes what imagery to use as well. And for me, that's especially true tonight, because the passage that we're going to be looking at has some pretty obvious imagery, and that's fishing. The problem is that I think I've been fishing maybe once in my entire life when I was 6. And I don't like seafood at all unless it's super battered and deep fried. You can't even tell it's fish anymore. So I wasn't sure what angle I should take tonight. How could I possibly lure everyone into the topic? How could I tackle a sermon that has to do with fishing? How could I make everyone roll their eyes in just the first few minutes of the sermon? Mission accomplished. But in actually reading through tonight's text, we can see, of course, that it's not just about fishing. The story that we'll be looking at tonight comes from Matthew 4, verses 18 through 22, which Erica is going to be reading for us. There she is. It will be up on the screen for you if you'd like to follow along, but also feel free to follow along in your pew Bibles as well.
As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James and Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boats and their father and followed him.
Thanks, Erica. In this passage tonight, we're going to learn what it means to be hooked on something. How, as followers of Christ, our lives become not just about ourselves, but about something and someone so much greater. When Jesus meets Simon, called Peter, and Andrew, they are fishing. And so he delivers one of his most famous lines that you probably heard before: "We will fish for people." Or, as you more likely heard it, "I will make you fishers of men." This means that rather than just catching fish, they're going to, in a manner of speaking, try to catch people. Now the question could be asked, what for? Our passage today takes place in the early stages of the story of Jesus' earthly ministry. And so he's beginning to build up a community, beginning to share what we would now call the good news of the gospel, that Christ had come to save the world from sin, that he had come to be the embodiment of God's love. He's the Son of God and the Son of Man. As important as their fishing trips might be, this is going to be something even greater. This new kind of fishing trip is going to change the world. And what's important for us today is that Jesus didn't just go and select a few random individuals. Instead, he begins with calling two sets of brothers to join him, people who were already in relationship. Because if they were going to start a new community and a new movement together, they would need to be hooked on each other. The disciples weren't called in isolation, but they were called in small groups. And they weren't sent out to do the work by themselves, but together. Now, up until this point in the Bible story, Jesus has been a bit of a solitary figure. Before our passage tonight, he's been baptized, and he spent time in the wilderness, he spent time preaching, but he hasn't called the disciples yet. And Matthew hasn't mentioned any friends or followers who may have been with him. But after our passage, they will always be together. Jesus will be followed by his 12 disciples, as well as many others who are inspired by his teachings and who want to live like him. And even in those moments when Jesus is alone, we will almost always hear about people who are nearby waiting for him, or people who are looking for him, wondering where he is. What's happening here is what Bible scholars call the founding of the Messianic community, which basically means it's the beginning of the church. Jesus is starting to put together a family. Now, I don't know if anyone here tonight is related, but I'm going to venture there's a pretty good guess that some of you are. A few, maybe hands raised if you've got at least one family member in this room. That's what I thought. I figured Classis Hamilton is a pretty connected community, And I've only lived here for 2 years, so I don't know whose uncle is married to whose mom's cousin's stepsister's Redeemer roommate. It's too much for me to try and figure out. What I do know for sure is that regardless of any of the connections that you have, all of us here tonight share the same blood. We are all bonded by the blood of Jesus Christ, who shed that blood so that we could share in his love together. And that makes us a family. So when you get together for youth group or retreats or All Ontario, you're getting to hang out with your brothers and sisters. You're learning from your honorary uncles and aunts and big brothers and big sisters. And then we get to gather here on a Sunday night, Sunday mornings, other times during the week, and have a little mini family reunion. When the organized Christian church first began, it took place in people's private dwellings, in their homes. They were called house churches. In some respects, today's church shouldn't be all that different. Because when we come to a church building to worship, to study, to eat, to count money, to have coffee, these buildings become our home. And when we follow Jesus' leading, when we fish for people, it means that we invite others to join the family and make this place their home too. We get hooked on each other. Throughout the Bible, even before Jesus was born, when God calls his people or sends them out to do something, it's so often done together, as friends, as family, as companions. And so that's how we're called to do our work as well, even if it's not always our instinct. Now, people often refer to my age group as the YouTube generation, because people my age didn't have YouTube yet in high school. And even if we did, my family still had dial-up. That's how old I am. So when we got to our 20s and we were living on our own for the first time, starting our careers, finding out our homes, suddenly we had YouTube there to help us. Whenever we needed to know something, when we had questions about how to do something, we'd usually go to the internet to find the answer. Instead of asking someone for help, we'd try to find some video tutorial online to help us out instead. And the thing is, you're probably all much better at anything on the internet than people my age are. And it'd be really easy for all of us to spend every night on our computers, our iPads, looking at videos or recipes or directions for whatever we need help with. My sister not only has the Fireplace channel, but she also has a Fireplace app on her tablet, even though she has a real fireplace in her home. She never needs to leave the couch. She doesn't need to come out on a cold night for a bonfire like this. But she's the one missing out. I promise it's going to be great. Now, I do want to stress there's nothing wrong with being introverted or wanting to spend time by yourself, because that's me. But God isn't saying that you need to have this giant group of people around you all the time. What he is saying is that we were made to be together, that what we all deserve is to have someone we can talk to, learn with, have a good time with. What we all need and deserve is someone who will know us well enough to know our strengths and our weaknesses, maybe even know when we need some space. Now, Jean Vanier is one of Canada's most well-known and respected theologians, and I admit I only just heard about him a few years ago when a friend gave me one of his books for Christmas. And, okay, we don't have the picture on the screen, but the cover does not look all that exciting. And so I put it off reading it for a long time. But the book is perfectly connected to tonight's topic. The book is called Becoming Human. And the entire point of the book is explaining how we as human beings need and desire people. It explores our relationships, how we interact with one another, how we sometimes hurt each other, how we spend time with each other. And all of that is what actually makes us human. And we become even more human when we grow in our relationships with each other and become more and more hooked on each other. As you guys all spend time together, you probably get to know one another and your youth leaders pretty well. You've probably got nicknames and inside jokes and so many memories together. You've gotten hooked on each other. You become friends, become family, and really know each other. Jesus asked for that same thing. To be friends, to really truly know us. And so just like we're hooked on each other, he wants us to be hooked on him. Now, the disciples in our passage today weren't just out fishing for fun. This was their livelihood, their source of income, and a big part of their identity. In some ways, they weren't necessarily hooked on their jobs. And so when Jesus calls them to follow him, they are literally leaving behind their safety nets. They leave behind their homes, members of their family, their income, their commitments, and all their responsibilities. And all because they become hooked on Christ. Because in their new lives as followers of Christ, he comes first, always. Now, this can, of course, sound kind of harsh. Because if we try to imagine what that would look like, we might have difficulty figuring out if we could do the same. Could we just walk away immediately from whatever task we're doing and give our entire lives over to Jesus Christ? Follow him wherever he might be leading us to go. What about our friends? What about our families, our jobs, our schools? That's the dilemma that many people face concerning this passage. How do we put Jesus before absolutely everything else that we love? And I think the answer is that without him, how would we be able to love all of those things in the first place? We love because he loves us. When we are hooked on each other, when we are in relationship with each other, it's because we are first hooked on Christ, in relationship with him, following him. Now, when you become a pastor or a ministry leader or a volunteer of some kind, you're often expected to study and to learn from a lot of different materials on leadership. And there's countless resources out there. And I thought about doing my usual thing and putting a selection up on the screen, but there's literally too many of them to recommend. It seems like everyone puts out a new edition every few years. But lately, there seems to be this new trend that many of these books are trying to get back to basics. There's so many books on Christian leadership that are becoming shorter. They're becoming much less complicated. And instead, they're all pointing back towards one book and one main character in that book. They're beginning to simply point back to the Bible, to Jesus Christ himself, looking to him for how we should work, live, play, preach, parent, date, make decisions, resolve conflicts, and be in relationships. And this does sound simple. And it seems as though this is something that we should have been doing all along. Trying to be like Jesus means following him, looking to him as our model and our guide, and being hooked on him. But of course, it's often easier said than done. So that's why we have youth ministries. We have other groups and programs in our churches and our schools. It's why we come to church together tonight, to learn from Jesus and to learn from him together, to be hooked on each other and hooked on him. You might be tempted to just see these groups as a good time, a night out, a chance to do some cool activities with our friends, but there's so much more than that. Because when we learn about Christ, we also learn how to be with each other. We deepen our connection to God and each other. Now, it might be hard to see the connection between doing a Bible study and then going bowling or laser tag. But when we learn about Christ, we learn how to be in relationship with him. We learn how to be in relationship with others. You can't be hooked on Christ. You can't be hooked on each other, You can't be hooked on anything else unless you are first hooked on Christ. Now, those of you from Ancaster CRC here tonight may know I'm a big fan of the 3-point sermon. So you might be wondering what number 3 is going to be. The thing is, I didn't necessarily have a number 3, so I'm going to cheat and do this. Number 1 was hooked on each other. Number 2 was hooked on Christ. And number 3 is going to be hooked on Christ again. Because as I'm sure your youth leaders tell you all the time, we can't underestimate how important this is. How important and vital Jesus Christ is to our everyday lives. It's not just something that he commands for us to follow him, but it's also something that he truly desires himself. He didn't just let the disciples know where he would be, but he came and found them. He met them in their place of work, in their daily lives. The King of Kings, the Savior of all creation, the Son of God, the Son of Man, he recruited ordinary fishermen, regular, honest, common people, like any one of us. Later in Matthew, Jesus tells us that blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Now, we don't know what Simon called Peter and Andrew and James and John were really like. But there's a pretty good chance that since they were human, at some point they were poor in spirit. At some point they were meek, mourning, hungry, thirsty, persecuted, or insulted. Because at some point, I think we all are. And yet, Jesus still calls them. And Jesus still calls us. He didn't go to the capital cities. He didn't go visit the rich and the famous and the obviously influential. Instead, he came and he called just such as us. Now, when I was first considering my call into ministry, I was absolutely meek and poor in spirit. Which isn't to say that I'm not usually still those things. But I had a lot of doubts about my calling and my gifts and my abilities, and I still do. When I was first considering becoming a pastor, the idea of something like standing up here and talking in front of people made me want to throw up. In fact, in grade 12, I think there's a few grade 12s here, I had to do a duet with a friend of mine for like a school talent night. And as soon as we were done singing, I walked directly out of the gym, directly to the washroom, and barely made it into the stall before I threw up everything I'd eaten that day. I was that terrified by it. And a lot of my life can be spent being pretty scared and pretty nervous. And maybe, I hope anyway, that's common for a lot of people, no matter what their job is or how old they are. But as I was going through all of this, I heard this line from a pastor. God doesn't just call the equipped, but he equips the called. When Christ asks us to follow him, no matter how nervous or scared we may be, he will be there for us. He will provide us with what we need to do that task. And when you cast a fishing net, you never know what you're going to get when you pull it in. It usually isn't just full of the fish that you were expecting and hoping for. When Jesus and his disciples started to fish for people, when they started to pull those nets in, they get us. All of us. This random group of people with different abilities, different looks, different gifts, different skills. People who can be poor in spirit, who can be meek or mourning or feeling insulted. But despite, or maybe because of, all of our differences and our inabilities, we're all in it together. And we are all in it with him. Hooked on each other and hooked on Christ. We are never too old or too young to be hooked on something. So no matter who you are, no matter where you're at in your own journey of faith, there is never a better time to get hooked on Christ. To draw closer to the people around you and learn together. And we all share in that opportunity. By simply being in this space tonight, we grow closer to each other and closer to God. Hooked on each other and hooked on him. So let's take advantage of those opportunities. Let's really cherish each other. Learn from each other. Treasure and value our relationship with Christ. And together always seek to follow him.